Hey y'all, so today I'm going to be wrapping up the books that I read in September and October. So I actually didn't do a ton of reading in September. My semester started in August and I got really busy and I just wasn't making time to read. But near the end of the month and through the month of August, I did a good amount of reading, both with physical books and with audiobooks, and I have 10 books here to wrap up for you guys. Some of these are books that I've already talked about a bit on my channel, and some of them are ones that I'm going to have full reviews up for, so I'm going to try to keep each book pretty concise. The first book that I read in the month of September was The Diviners by Libba Bray, which I listened to on audiobook. I first read this physical copy in 2014 in October as kind of like a creepy reading marathon, and I absolutely loved it. And since it had been 2 years since I read it, I wanted to go back and reread it and remember what happened so that I could jump into the sequel, and so I went ahead and listened to the audiobook. Before September, I hadn't really listened to audiobooks very much, but I'd heard a lot of great things about this audiobook, and I was not disappointed. It was a fantastic audiobook and it really set the 1920s mood really well, and I absolutely loved it. It was creepy in the right places. The narrator was amazing. Overall, I loved re-experiencing this book through a different medium, and I would recommend it both in physical book form and in audiobook form. And once again, like the first time, I gave it 9.5 stars out of 10, which translates to 5 out of 5 on Goodreads. And then after rereading The Diviners, I of course jumped into Lair of Dreams by Libba Bray, and after loving that audiobook, I decided to listen to this one on audiobook too. And I found this to be a really solid sequel to The Diviners. I didn't love it quite as much as the first one. I ended up giving it 9 stars out of 10, which translates to 4 out of 5 on Goodreads. There are some new characters introduced in this book, and there are some really intriguing new plots that are followed throughout this. And overall, I just thought it was a really intriguing sequel. Like I said, I didn't love it quite as much as the first book because it features some characters that I didn't quite love as much as some of the ones that were focused on in the first book. But like I said, overall, solid sequel. I love consistency in series, and so far the series is really impressing me. If you love historical fiction and paranormal, I would definitely recommend that you check the series out because this series has some very intricate plots that get woven together in really interesting ways and a lot of really intriguing characters that you really grow to love. And like I mentioned with the audiobooks, the 1920s atmosphere blends really well with this very creepy tone, and it's just really cool. The next book that I read was Monster: The Perfect Edition Volume 1 by Naoki Urasawa. Each volume of the Perfect Editions is comprised of 2 of the original volumes, so this volume has volumes 1 and 2 in it. So in this story, we follow Dr. Tenma, who's this guy on the cover, as he is trying to unravel these murders. It's very hard to explain everything that leads him to this point, but essentially he saves the life of someone who then becomes a murderer, and he feels some guilt over this, and so he starts hunting down this killer because he's also kind of suspected of doing these killings. It's a very confusing thing to try to describe. I've seen this compared to Death Note, and I can definitely see the comparisons. It has a similar tone and a similar vibe, and I think that if you like Death Note, you will like this series. It took me a while to actually appreciate these volumes. At first, I gave this 7.5 out of 10, which is 3 out of 5 on Goodreads, but I ended up bumping it up to 4 out of 5 or 8 out of 10 because I really enjoyed this setup once I got further into the volumes. It's a really intriguing story and a really intriguing premise, and I think that these 2 volumes set up the story really well. I'm now going to go slightly out of order because I have read 3 more volumes in the Monster series throughout the past month and a half, and I didn't read them like directly 3, 4, 5, and nothing else in between, but since I'm already on the topic, I might as well talk about them. So next in the series is Volume 3, which is 511 Kinderheim, and I ended up giving this one 8.5 stars out of 10. This volume really added a really interesting level of intricacy to the story, and it's so far my favorite volume in the series. Next in the series is volume 4, Asa's Friend, and I gave this one 7 out of 10, which is 3 out of 5 on Goodreads. Overall, I liked it, but it felt like a diversion from the main storyline, and I wasn't really sure how some of the things connected to the main plot, but overall, it was an interesting addition to the series. Volume 5 is After the Carnival, and I ended up giving this one 7 out of 10 as well, which is 3 out of 5 on Goodreads. Like with the last one, I still liked it, but for this one, I felt like not much happened until kind of near the end. But like I said, overall, this is a really interesting series, and I'm really curious to see where it goes from here. I just haven't been reading a lot lately, but I think I'm going to try to start picking up some of the volumes so I can start getting through them again. Next up is another book that I actually listened to in audiobook form, and that is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Now, if you're familiar at all with this book, you know that everyone has a really hard time explaining what it's about. A lot of people after reading it are like, I still don't know exactly what this story was about. And I agree with them to some extent. I think that the story is hard to explain to people who haven't read it. I feel like I completely understand the story based on the context within it that I learned throughout it, but I feel like it's really hard to explain it to people who are not familiar with that context. At its most base form, this story is of a man recounting some weird events that happened as a child. To me, this story read kind of like a mix of a children's story and a creepypasta, or if it's a better reference point to you, a no sleep story, which I know sounds kind of weird to combine a children's story with a creepy twist-filled story online, but honestly that's kind of what it was. I feel like this story kind of has a bit of a fantastical realism to it, and it's just a really interesting story that, like I said, is hard to explain to people who are unfamiliar with it. Personally, I didn't like the book Through the Woods by Emily Carroll. I thought it was a little uninspired, but I do think that The Ocean at the End of the Lane kind of did the same thing, but better. So if you did like Through the Woods, I would definitely recommend checking out The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Overall, I ended up giving The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman 8.5 stars out of 10, which translates to 4 out of 5 on Goodreads. For me, 8.5 stars out of 10 is kind of my really solid book rating. It's a book that I really enjoyed and is definitely one that is going to stick with me and that I'm going to think about, but it's not one that had one defining quality that made it outstanding or just an overall outstanding book. Overall, I thought it was a really well-written and very unique story. Next up is another that I listened to on audiobook, and that is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. In this adult psychological thriller, our main character is a physics professor at a small community college. In a weird series of events, he's kidnapped one night, and when he wakes up the next day, he's in a world that doesn't really feel like his own. His life is completely different, and everything has changed. And he sets off to figure out what is going on and to try and unravel the mysteries surrounding what happened to him. Like with The Ocean at the End of the Lane, I ended up giving this one 8.5 stars out of 10, which translates to 4 out of 5 on Goodreads. Once again, a really, really good and solid book, but nothing that sent it over the edge for me that made me completely fall in love with it. I found the plot to be really interesting because for a psychological thriller, some of the middle of it was a little bit slow. It wasn't something that I minded, but it was something that surprised me a little bit. Overall, I thought that this was a really interesting and very complex story, and I really enjoyed it. The next book that I read was The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, which I listened to on audiobook. Depending on how you look at this, it's either a modern classic or a classic horror novel because it was written in the 1950s. In this story, a doctor is doing research at this house called Hill House, trying to see if there's any paranormal activity going on. And he invites a few other people to Hill House with him to help him investigate what's going on. Overall, this story was not quite what I expected, but it was really interesting nonetheless. I ended up giving this book 8 stars out of 10, which translates to 4 out of 5, but I was very on the fence about whether to give it 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5. I ended up doing the 4 out of 5 because I did really enjoy reading this book. It was a very interesting and very compelling read. I went into it expecting, a haunted house, but it was actually a little bit more of a character study with some interesting paranormal elements thrown in. I don't want to say too much else and risk spoiling anything, but it's a fairly quick read, and it was a really intriguing take on kind of the haunted house trope. And finally, the last book that I read in October was also my favorite book that I read throughout these last few months, and that is The Forgetting by Sharon Cameron. I've talked about this a bit on my channel already, and I do plan on filming a book review for this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but I'll talk about it a little bit. This is a dystopian novel that takes place in a society where every 12 years this thing called the forgetting happens and everyone loses their memories. But for some reason, the forgetting does not affect our main character, Nadia, and she sets off to unravel the secrets surrounding the forgetting. I gave this book a full 10 out of 10 stars. I absolutely loved it, and if you want to hear more about my thoughts on it, I will leave a link up in the cards to the review once it goes live. But I'm assuming that the review will be up after this video, so if you're watching this in the first few days that this is up, hang tight, the review will be coming in a few days. So that is it for the books that I read in September and October. I haven't been reading a ton over the past few weeks, but that's because I've been a little busy. Because I've been preparing for NaNoWriMo and it is now upon us, so I have been just doing a ton of writing. I will leave a link down in the description to my NaNoWriMo page if you want to go ahead and add me as a buddy. As always, I will leave links down in the description to all of my social media accounts, including my Harry Potter analysis blog that I started last month. Please add me as a friend on Goodreads. I would love to be friends with all of you on Goodreads. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!